Late light settles across the desert in long gold bands, ridge after ridge lies smooth and perfect, each dune holding its curve as if wind has just finished shaping it. Nothing moves, except the loose upper grains slipping down the leeward faces. Far below, in the troughs between the slopes, tiny salt shell animals begin to appear, pale bead-like bodies drifting out from the cool shadows. They move in loose, glittering lines toward the open valleys, using the final warmth of day to cross ground that will soon turn cold from above. The scene looks harmless. Gentle contours, soft light. A field of dunes so regular it could be mistaken for stillness itself, but along one crest, a dark line forms where no shadow should be. The ridge does not collapse, it parts. The opening is narrow at first, a seam in the sand, then wider, curving inward along the whole length of the dune. Air begins to slide into it, the nearby grains lift, hesitate, and roll toward the gap. The line deepens into a slit so dark it seems to erase part of the desert. The dune is not breaking, it is waking. Across the basin, more ridges begin to change, one opens, then another farther off. Then a third. The valley floor remains quiet, but the skyline is no longer stable. Curves that looked sculpted by weather are revealing themselves as folded lips, their edges lined with dense combs of fine mineral spines. The desert has not been waiting for wind. It has been waiting for night. Cold air arrives with sunset. It pours low through the channels between the dunes, carrying dry dust, glittering salt flakes, and the smallest migrants of the valley. The open ridges inhale in slow, measured pulls. Sand does not simply blow past them, it streams inward in silver ribbons, narrowing as it enters the dark openings. The salt shell animals try to keep low, anchoring themselves with tiny hooked limbs. Some hold, others begin to slide. The first inhalation is almost elegant, a gentle flow, a whisper through the basin. The animals nearest the open ridge vanish one by one, not in panic, not in violence, but as though the ground has decided to keep them. The dune's mouth closes slightly between breaths, then opens again. Each cycle is deeper than the last, seen close. The inner surfaces are not raw sand. They are living tissue disguised by a day's worth of settled grains. Moist membranes lie beneath a skin of dust, ribbed with flexible arches that widen and contract with each draw of air. Along the inner grooves, mineral cilia comb the incoming stream, stripping out edible particles from the flow. Dense dust adheres to sticky folds, microbial films bloom where the night moisture condenses. Tiny animals strike the inner combs, stall, and are guided inward by the next breath. The dunes are filter feeders. By daylight, they sleep sealed beneath a coating of loose sand, holding still enough to pass for landscape. Their bodies lie buried in long crescent masses beneath each ridge, anchored deep in the cooler layers. Sunlight keeps them dormant. Heat would dry their membranes and attract scavenging burrowers. But once the surface cools and the night wind strengthens, the ridges open. The dunes begin feeding on everything the dark air carries across them. Farther down the valley, the salt shell migration thickens. Hundreds of the tiny animals move together, following old scent trails through the troughs. Their shells are made of layered mineral salts, translucent at the edges, each body no larger than a thumbprint. They emerge nightly from crusted nests around the lower flats to graze on airborne frost and microscopic algae that gather along the cooling surface. Usually the wind is only a hazard. Tonight, it is also a conveyor. One dune opens directly in the path of the moving line. The animals at the front stop, sensing the altered airflow. The crest above them is too smooth to read as danger, too familiar to provoke alarm. Then the next inhalation begins. The sand around their feet starts moving first, a soft hiss, a fine stream, a widening pull. Several animals tumble forward, their limbs scrabbling for purchase as the ground itself loosens beneath them. The mouth does not lunge. It does not chase. It waits and breathes. That is what makes the feeding field so difficult to recognize. Nothing in the valley resembles a hunter. There are no leaps, no strikes, no sudden shadows. The rhythm is geological. One ridge opens. Another answers, then three more farther off, not in exact unison, but in overlapping waves that pass from basin to basin. The whole dune field begins to inhale in sequence like an immense sleeping body drawing breath through many mouths. Moonlight clarifies what sunset concealed. Under the silver wash, the desert floor is crossed by dark slits and curved openings, some short and shallow, some stretching the full length of a ridge. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every graceful crescent in the landscape is potentially a face. Every sheltered trough is a feeding lane. Every night wind is a delivery system. The salt shell animals are not the only prey moving through it. Fine strand larvae lift from the basin crusts when the temperature drops. Dust swimmers, barely visible, skim in the lower air on vibrating fins. Needle-back driftlings unroot themselves from shallow sand and let the wind carry them toward new ground. All of them become part of the suspended stream the dunes are built to filter. Near one open mouth, grains of white mineral dust spiral inward along the lip and catch on vibrating fronds. The fronds shake the particles loose into a deeper channel. Behind them, broader folds absorb moisture condensed from the cooling air. Behind those, muscular chambers pulse slowly, driving the breath. The dune is not eating only animals. It is collecting a whole night harvest: dust, salts, microbes, spores, drifting eggs, and the occasional body large enough to matter. The beauty of the system is also its threat. A feeding dune must remain almost indistinguishable from terrain or nothing would pass near it. Over long ages, shape and ecology have merged. The very profile that wind would naturally carve happens to be the best possible profile for sleeping concealment and nocturnal airflow capture. The desert looks the way it does, because the dunes are alive, and the dunes survive by looking exactly like the desert. At the center of the basin, a larger ridge begins to open. It is broader than the others, and the dark seam runs nearly from one end of the slope to the other. Air turns toward it from all directions. Loose sand begins to stream inward in pale ribbons. Small animals that have avoided the earlier mouths now find themselves caught in a wider current around the opening. Other ridges adjust their own breathing, closing slightly as the larger feeder takes the main flow. The field is not random. It is coordinated. A large dune is an old individual, thick-bodied below the surface and surrounded by smaller satellite mouths. Together they form a feeding colony. The satellite ridges catch coarse material and wandering prey from the outer lanes. The central mouth receives the strongest stream and filters the finest fraction of the night wind. Resource use is divided across scale. In the morning, nutrient-rich waste will be released downslope, seeding the crust fields where the next wave of small grazers will feed. What looks like predation is also landscape engineering. The salt shell animals know some part of this without ever seeing the whole design. The oldest among them avoid certain troughs, turn at certain wind angles, and hesitate when the cold draft comes from an unexpected direction. Their roots arc between the safest basins, tracing a memory of mouths below the level of conscious choice. But the dunes shift their openings with age, health, and season. A safe corridor one month becomes a feeding lane the next. The migrants survive by reading a landscape that is itself changing as it feeds. Wind intensifies toward midnight. Now the inhalations deepen. Several mouths widen enough to show the ribbed arches inside, each arch flexing under a skin of dampened sand. Fine spray from condensed night moisture glints along the inner margins. Small prey items strike, rebound, and disappear on the return pull. The sound across the basin is no longer a whisper. It is a low field of breathing: draw, pause, settle, draw again. A cluster of salt shell animals reaches a narrow saddle between two dunes and stops. On one side the trough ahead lies open and still, on the other, a faint inward draft lifts the grains around their feet. The lead animal turns, shell catching moonlight, and the group follows. A second later the quiet trough opens down its center, too late to catch them. The ground misses its meal. Elsewhere, another ridge has better luck. A silver stream of dust carries three small bodies straight over the lip and into darkness. Nothing is wasted inside the mouth. Mineral spines trap shell fragments, mucus folds draw out moisture, soft tissues sort organic particles from indigestible grains, passing heavy sand back out in low exhalations before dawn. The dune feeds slowly, efficiently, and with extraordinary patience. It does not need a dramatic kill, it only needs the wind to keep delivering. Seen from high above, the desert is now transformed. Dozens of ridges stand open across the basin, each one taking in pale moving streams that resemble river mouths reversed, not pouring outward but pulling inward from the sea of sand. The whole field breathes in staggered rhythm. One opening narrows as another widens. A line of smaller mouths near the western slope pulses together, then falls still in the northern flats. A chain of shallow feeders opens one after another as the cold current shifts. The landscape has become a living respiratory map. Toward the far edge of the feeding field, some dunes never open at all. These are juveniles, too small to maintain full mouth tissues, surviving instead by absorbing nutrients, washed downslope from the larger feeders. Their ridges remain smooth through the night, but under the surface their bodies are growing, storing mass, and learning the airflow of the basin through pressure-sensitive channels. In a few seasons, each will split its first seam and join the breathing pattern. Not every mouth belongs to the same lineage. Some ridges inhale deeply and briefly, specializing in larger drifting prey, others take shallower, continuous breaths, collecting fine dust and microbial rain in older valleys. Mixed colonies share the same dune field, their rhythms interlocking rather than competing. The desert does not belong to one organism repeated. It belongs to a guild of terrain, feeders whose bodies have merged with the shape of wind. The feeding slows near dawn, the night air weakens. The silver streams thin. One by one, the mouths begin to close, drawing their lips together with a final soft collapse of sand. The inner combs vanish beneath settling grains, moist tissues retreat from the exposed margins. The dark seams narrow into shadows and then into nothing. Where a mouth lay open minutes earlier, only a flawless ridge remains. The survivors of the migration continue across the cooling flats behind them. The desert is becoming innocent again. Gold rises back into the dunes as morning light returns. The valleys appear untouched, all evidence of the night's breathing buried beneath a new skim of windblown sand. Then, at the crest of the central ridge, a final slit remains open a moment longer than the rest. A last ribbon of silver dust slips inward. The lip closes. The curve smooths. Sunrise spreads over a perfect dune field, soft and beautiful and still. Nothing in the scene suggests hunger, except that somewhere beneath the golden surface, the whole desert is sleeping with its mouths closed, waiting for dark.